Welcome to Leaders of Tomorrow, 10 seasons of recognizing champions, 10 seasons of rewarding excellence. That's what we're all about here on the Leaders of Tomorrow, as we bring you the most expert voices to guide you along your journey of growth. I'm Sunanda Jayaseelan. On the show tonight, we're bringing you a policy voice, a macroeconomic voice, one of the sharpest minds when it comes to macroeconomic policy, whether it's here in India or globally. It's my pleasure to welcome on the show Surjit Bhalla. He's Executive Director, IMF for India. He's an author, he's an economist and a columnist. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on the launch edition of what is definitely a momentous year for us and a momentous landmark, the 10th edition of the Leaders of Tomorrow, talking to India's entrepreneurs and bringing expert voices like yourself, particularly on the big picture, on the macro picture. So thank you once again for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. My pleasure. Yeah.
I want to kick today's conversation off by first getting your outlook for 2022. Things are changing, of course, because the third wave that we were all dreading, if I can call it that, has well and truly kicked off. But with that being said, perhaps in the short or the midterm, what might your outlook for 2022 be?
What we have all learned over the last 2 years is that it's very hazy making forecast of the economy and especially of growth. But having got that caveat out of the way, it does appear as if that the third wave around the world is considerably less serious than either of the first two waves. And whether one looks at infections or looks at hospitalizations or the seriousness of the infections or deaths, it is of a considerably weaker variety. And it may be, if one has to make a forecast, it may be part of the end game that after we are through with the third wave, it's very unlikely that there is a fourth wave of any duration. Obviously, there might be minor. So I think that suggests that the picture is much better than at any time over the last 2 years. We've all been stumped. So we should recognize that we've all been stumped. We've all been wrong at one time or another.
Sure.
And maybe all of us have been wrong simultaneously. But I think better days, my forecast would be that better days definitely lie ahead for the economy and for the COVID and for the world.
That's definitely a very good note to kick off today's conversation on. I want to talk about some comments that I saw that you had made in an article you wrote in August of last year, saying that the reformist trend in Modi 2.0, it's not only continuing, but it's also strengthening. So maybe the 2 or 3 things that you think are definitely going to be necessary for India to continue on the kind of growth momentum we've seen in the past.
It's very important to put the context of the reform trend in India with what has happened. This COVID business is universal. It has affected every country. And that's why I want to put it in the context that there were very, very few countries that attempted to do any reforms whatsoever. So that article was, I think, to do with never waste a crisis. And we have been numero uno. I've looked at other countries. For example, there are about 3 or 4 other countries of the whole set that have tried to implement reforms and done a beginning. Brazil is one of them. Indonesia is another one. And India is way off the pack. Now, I realize that some of the reforms, in particular, the farm sector reform was withdrawn. But even ignoring that the sum total of all the reforms that have been instituted over the last couple of years has been quite enormous. And that is what is going to So regardless of which, for example, you mentioned about privatization, I think that, we have crossed the Rubicon, we've crossed the line. Once you get started on this, there is no turning back, in my view. And I think the Air India privatization was a major victory, success for reforms. As you know, it has been going on for the last 30 years. Every year you pick up the newspaper and there was talk about Air India being privatized. It never happened. So I think rather than putting in targets as to what, I think it is here to stay and will continue and even accelerate as over the next couple of years.
So you're talking about the Air India privatization. I want to talk about some of the other announcements or reforms, call it what you may, that we've seen over the past few years. And, in 2019, for instance, when you were speaking about the retrospective tax, that of course came as a big shocker, if I can call it that, to most people, particularly those who watch the kind of impact of India Inc. and corporate India. That is one. Two is GST. Three, of course, is while India might be doing better as far as the ease of doing business report is concerned, year on year, we're definitely inching up the rank. What's it going to take to ensure that this definitely becomes a great place to do business? You're definitely attracting more private investment. What's it going to take?
If you look at in detail of across countries about what has happened to export growth and tax revenue in India compared to the other countries and even compared to our own past, this is almost unheard of. Given that our exports are up, as you know, about 35% over 2 years ago. So we are not comparing exports to what happened in 2020. We are comparing it to 2019. Yeah. And that suggests that this is, and a 30% increase in dollar terms is really the last time anything close like that happened was in 2007, 8, thereabouts, when the whole world was booming. This has happened when the whole world is not booming. Then let's look at the tax revenues. And, I remember when in 2019, when the corporate tax cut came into being, there was a lot of criticisms from the usual suspects that no, this is not going to improve tax revenue, etc., etc. And what has happened? Corporate taxes, personal income taxes, GST you mentioned, other indirect taxes are all up about 30 to 40% over 2 years ago. This is certainly, I haven't seen this other than when the economy is really booming. This is an economy in decline in terms of the world was in decline. So I'm talking about world growth. And 2019, as you know, was 2019-20 was 2020-21 was a negative year in GDP growth. And despite that, this has been hugely successful. So I think something structural has happened. And that needs to be, and that is permanent. The compliance has certainly gone up. I remember when, I don't know about you in particular, but everybody was, or many people were criticizing demonetization. Mm-hmm. And I made it a point to say that one of the big effects of demonetization would be that there would be an increase in compliance. So given what has happened, you don't have the income growth, but you have compliance growth, which is increasing the amount of taxes available. So that's a huge success. And I don't think I've seen too much commentary on that. But I think that deserves a lot of commentary. Has there? So I would pose it as a question that has there been a structural change, in India's tax revenue collection all across the board and India's export growth? My answer is very definitely there has been a structural change. So therefore, that is something that is going to feed in throughout now in the future. One other point, since we're talking about economic growth, is that compared to, and again, people were very hasty in concluding when we had a negative growth last year, and one of the largest, it wasn't the largest in the world, but amongst the major economies, it was amongst the top 10 deepest declines, about 7.5%, and some countries were 8, 9, and the average itself was something like 5%. So, I think there is a tendency to exaggerate the negative stuff, which I've noticed, and what is now turning out is that exaggeration was really, really misplaced. This economy is at the forefront this year, and I think it will be in the future. Take, for example, normally we compare ourselves to China, etc., as we should, and China is in a structural decline in terms of growth rates. So they are somewhere growing at maybe 5% and on a steady path to go down to about 4% and 3% over the next 4 or 5 years.
Sure.
I expect Indian GDP growth to be closer to 8%, 7 to 9, give or take. And obviously, if world economy recovers faster, we will grow faster. We'll be closer to the upper end. So, the macro situation, inflation, another thing we haven't talked about, inflation is well under control. And I think it has been exaggerated around the world, the nature of inflation, because this has been not due to demand, because demand, as we know, as I just discussed, that basically economic growth around the world, minus 5%. And now you have this. So I think this is supply considerations, a little bit of pent-up demand, but mostly supply bottlenecks that have appeared.
Sure.
They will disappear. They will dissipate over time. So I think the world economy, and India in particular, looks very good 3 to 6 months hence and continuing. And I think we will continue to outperform other major economies in a significant manner.
I'm going to take a quick break on that note. Back in just a moment. Welcome back. You're with us here on Leaders of Tomorrow. And tonight on the show, our Leaders of Tomorrow icon is Surjit Bhalla.
I just very briefly want to talk about the NPA figures. You, of course, I'm sure are aware of this. This is more for the benefit of our audience. Gross NPA of private banks has improved to 3.94%. This is as of the end of September 2021 on a Y-on-Y basis. NPAs for India's SMEs and MSMEs have also improved as of the middle of last year. You were saying, you used the word misleading. Would any sort of sigh of relief at this point as far as how the liquidity situation, the NPA situation is looking like, perhaps be misplaced at this point? Is there, much more that we need to be watching for?
Well, I think, look, as I said, I've continuously emphasized and what I think many critics did not emphasize on the universal nature of the slowdown, of the decline. I gave you some average numbers, etc. And if you now look at, and most countries around the world are, not most countries around the world, a significant portion of the major economies around the world, especially Europe and the US, are now above their 2021 level in terms of GDP. We are also above the 2019-20 level, pre-pandemic level. So that's number one. Number two is consumption growth is slower in recovery in India, but also across the world. So I think all I'm trying to emphasize is that we are no longer, and haven't been for the last 15, 20 years, an economy in isolation. We are part of the global economy, and global trends are what are most meaningful in order to both assess our performance and to compare our performance with what should be expected. In that regard, as I mentioned, on taxes, on revenue, on GDP, on export growth and GDP growth, we are actually in the top of the league, very close to.
I want to talk about employment, or rather unemployment figures. For the benefit of our viewers, unemployment recently released data showing was at a 4-month high. Also, fewer women have returned to the formal workforce post the pandemic. How do you see unemployment really panning out in the next couple of months?
This deserves a separate detailed conversation for the following reason. The unemployment data that you are referring to has to do with CMI data.
Yes.
And I have written on it, I'm writing more on it. There are I have some serious reservations about the CMI data. Okay. For example, and you mentioned about women, the women's labor force participation rate in CMIE is consistently reporting that only 10 to 12% of women are working. Mm-hmm. Now, this is lower than Yemen. So I think we all have to take a sit back. I mean, what are the factors that are causing this to be that low? Now, there was a time use survey done, NSSO survey in 2019. Yeah. After that, there is the periodic labor force survey, which shows that the women's labor force participation rate is considerably higher than 10, almost 3 times higher to 2.5 times. So I would ask you guys, in order to do a correct interpretation of the Indian economy, we can't take a survey that misses the mark by a huge margin. I have seen more women in top jobs, etc., than ever before. I'll mention you another important aspect about what's happening, and that is that for the first time in Indian history, there are more women graduating from college than there are men. So we have to take a look back as to what some of the statistics we cite in order to see, is it plausible or is it anywhere close to reality? And if it is not, then we begin to question. Now, the argument is made, but the periodic labor force survey comes with a lag of 3 months or 6 months. Well, we have been working with a lag for 5 years, etc., because that was the normal routine until 2017-18, that after that, there are annual periodic labor force surveys. And just because there is a daily unemployment rate, which feeds into what you guys call news, I think is not very professional.
Educated unemployment, sir, people perhaps in jobs which are not really requiring or utilizing fully their skill sets, particularly the young people. I would love to get your views on that.
So this is, one of the factors around the world, including the US and Western economies, and over the last 10 years or so, is that the educated, if you were more educated, you had a premium in terms of your wage and your growth in your wages. This has declined. And why it has declined is for the reason I just mentioned, that there are many, many more people going into college. So there is a quote unquote relative surplus of college graduates. If you look at, I've looked at now on the periodic labor force survey data, that the wages for salaried people from between the ages of 15 to 34, women are now earning the same amount as men. Normally, the gap is about 25%. In India, it was also 25%. And in the US, after you control for education and various other factors, the gap gets down to 10%. In India, for salaried people, who are the most educated people, there is no gap in wages between men and women. This is a structural break, another structural break that has been happening in the Indian economy. In terms of jobs for the educated, as I said, relative to what we saw when educated labor was scarce, what you would predict, what I would predict, what any economist would predict, is that wages would rise faster. Now, the college wages are not rising faster, and indeed, between 2011 and 2017-18, the periodic labor NSSO surveys for the 2 years, that real wages of college workers has stayed about the same. The wages of non-college workers have increased in real terms by about 2 to 3% per annum. So these are big macro changes that are taking place. And independent of, if you will, any specific policy, rather than the fact women are getting more educated, there's much more labor supply, educated labor supply, and therefore the relative wage of educated workers is going down.
Thank you so much for giving us a sneak peek into Surjit Bhalla, the person, away from the cameras and from all the interviews. And thank you so much for opening up to our audience here on Leaders of Tomorrow.
My pleasure.
That's all the time we have on the show tonight. If you have any feedback for us, do let us know. Our contact details on your screens as we speak. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.